Hey everybody, Ken Rimple and Sujal Kapadia here. We have brought a guest to the show today, DaShaun Carter. Say hello.
Hello, hello from Kansas City.
Oh, that's where you are.
Yes,
Cool. Kansas City, Missouri, or Kansas City, Kansas. And by the
Missouri
way,
side.
okay, is there one that is like, no, this is a Kansas City, or do both cities say the same thing?
No, no, no. I think both cities try to make sure to say, Kansas City, Kansas or Kansas City, Missouri. I think when we're talking with folks, even here, we're like, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
where are you at? And I'm outside of Kansas City. I'm in one of the suburbs called Grain Valley,
Mm-hmm.
but I say Kansas City. I claim
Cool.
Kansas City.
There's multiple Philadelphias as well.
Yes.
Yeah, it's true. Philadelphia, Mississippi, and I don't know what the other ones are, but yeah. Well, that's it. At any rate, thank you very much for being here. We had a great time when you came out and spoke at Philly Emerging Technologies for the Enterprise. Your Philly ETE shirt is showing that.
Yes.
Wonderful talk, and if anyone is interested, we'll post the link to that right here, which is I will never let my children deploy active passive.
My children will never deploy active passive. That's just the way it is. They can do all sorts of stuff. They can get all sorts of trouble, but that's not one of the things they're going to do. Is they're going active active.
Is it just that they're too young to know to do the wrong thing? Because that's what kids will always do
You
the
don't let
wrong
them,
thing.
right? It's like brush your teeth, active active. Like it all depends on what you're gonna what are you gonna teach them.
If it's my child, she'd probably like start up a bunch of nodes and there'll be a bunch of zombie processes. Like she'll forget about them. They'll just keep running until they keel over.
Yeah, I mean, and that happens too, right? There's a lot of things that we've put into production, and the difference is if you were doing active passive, it might fall over and not come back up. But if we're deploying active active, then they're just going to be up.
That talk
Like
really hit home for me because my first, I would say, real large like distributed computing um, thing, and I was working for a defense contractor, Lockheed at the time, many years ago. And I was very proud of this. And at the time, it felt like it was state of the art, but it was active passive with database replication and then some Cisco Global Site Selector
oh yeah,
changing DNS and choosing the failover version and then making the standby active. And I was like, this is awesome. This is great.
yeah. And the whole like one of the things that I said was it's about money for me, right? If you're doing active passive, you've got all of the infrastructure someplace else. And maybe in your case, maybe it's in more than one place, but it's not being used. And just that hurt. That was pain to me.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily like that active is better. You can still have your different levels of resiliency and the gap. And hello, Simon, glad to see you. And you have these different options, but the active approach allowed me to use all the resources that I was paying for.
Exactly.
And in that startup mindset, maybe it's a cultural thing. I didn't like wasting money, so let me use it, and I felt like I had more confidence. I had better resiliency, and we kind of showed it. So it was fun. And today, in 2023, it's actually pretty easy to do some of these advanced architectures using Spring Cloud, and Kubernetes, or the example we did was Azure Spring Apps for Enterprise. It makes it super simple. There wasn't a whole lot to it.
So I want to ask you a question just to kind of level set the people who are watching this who may not know you already. How
Okay.
did you get involved in Spring in general? Besides, like, if you're like me, it's been a while, right? But
Been around for a long time. I remember the conversation. I started my career. I started doing Java in the 90s. Uh,
mhm.
I think it really took off with Java 1.2. But then I got into my career, 1999, the dot-com boom. And I was doing e-commerce apps, a lot of JSP, 0.98 spec, 0.98a spec, is what I was using, and I was taking it to production because it worked. Um, but I remember coming out of this EJB space and doing a lot of stuff with EJBs to Craig Comstock introduced me to Spring. He's like, no, yeah. Have you ever thought about it this way? It makes it really easy. But I was all kind of overwhelmed, and I had all of this luggage, this scar tissue and experience with EJBs. So I was like, I got it. Like, I understand how to do EJBs. I don't need that Spring stuff. And then we started using Spring. And I was like, how is this so easy? Why was I doing all of that stuff with the EJBs and all the mess and the configuration when I could do it this way. So it was Craig Comstock that gave me the introduction, and that might have been 2003, 2004.
That was very early.
Yeah, it was super early.
Mm-hmm.
And he kind of put it on the radar. We started using it. I think I was taking things to production in 2005. And then it shifted. I got away from it a little bit, and then it was always there. There was always something that I was deploying, with the Spring configs. But really, it got exciting in 2010, 2013, in that time frame. I was doing a lot of comparisons with different frameworks and how to take things to production. Time mattered, response mattered, the ease of operation mattered. And when Spring Boot came along, when I finally uncovered it, I was doing a comparison with Spring Boot and Drop Wizard, right? I knew that I needed some of these 12-factor type things, these production-ready type features, and I did for a long time. I was doing this head-to-head battle, like, hey, is this easy? And I was looking at it in a way that it's not just about what goes to production, but it's about how easy I could get people to consume it, because at the time I had people on my team that were all over the world. And Spring Boot checked the box, and it got me excited for multiple reasons. And and that's really where it took off. I got excited about it. I dug deep. It gave me some freedom to do more things on my laptop, because Spring Boot had the Tomcat application included. So I was able to kind of shift between projects on my, at the time, 8 gig laptop. And that made it exciting. And my personal laptop, that was my 8 gig work laptop, and my personal one only had 4 gigs, but I could still do stuff with Spring Boot on this 4 gig laptop. So I was super excited. And then it just kind of took off from there. So now, now I got excited about Spring Boot. I went and I did some things at a startup, and it was all Spring based. Then we kind of added on some .NET, some steel toe, so we could kind of have the same patterns and take it to the same platform. We were using DCOS at first, and then we kind of shifted over to Cloud Foundry, and we had lots of success. So I was happy. I was doing these cool things. I felt like we were able to keep up with all the releases that were happening, and I was just a happy customer. So I called up a couple folks, and I said, hey, I'd like to do more, and I ended up working at Pivotal, where they were taking care of Spring. And at that time, I was a platform architect, so I was working with all sorts of customers all over, but I was still enjoying it. And then I went and spent a little bit of time over at Redis, and then I came back. So now I'm back at VMware as a Spring developer advocate, just sharing the love and getting to work with customers all over the world and help them enjoy. My first year, my goal was to find one person that was half as excited as I was in 2015, because I was not just drinking the Kool-Aid, I was making the Kool-Aid. Like, man, you guys got to try this. This is so great. And if I could just find one, and I did. I realized that I did when I was at VMware Explorer in Barcelona. VMware Explorer in San Francisco, the people were definitely there. I had great conversations, lots of folks that kind of understood. They had that like one foot in the app dev side, but also they had a foot in the let's make sure that it's running in production side. And that's kind of where I like to sit, right? Mm-hmm. It's not just about, I don't really go deep on the language. I'll be, honest. I care about getting things to production. I care about having things run, being able to be resilient. But like the language features, all the awesome language features that have been added to Java over the last couple of years, they kind of went over my head. The things that get me excited are how much faster the JVM is these days, how much easier it is to get a Spring Boot app into production these days. The Spring team has done amazing things. And then the native stuff. I started playing with the native stuff early, and I've got Raspberry Pis sitting here in my office where I'm deploying Spring workloads to these Raspberry Pi devices, ARM64, with 512 megs of RAM on the device. And I'm running Spring Cloud, Spring Boot workloads. And it's still exciting, and it still blows my mind that that's even possible.
Using crawl, I'm assuming for that, correct?
Yeah, that's one of the features that was it went GA with Spring Boot 3, Spring Framework 6 is this ability to do ahead of time processing, AOT processing with
Mhm.
Graal VM. So the Spring team and the Graal VM team worked really close to help make it possible. And that's one of the big features. It's the one that has me the most excited about Spring Boot 3 and 3.1 now is being able to deliver native images with Spring Boot apps.
So that's a good point. So let's talk a bit about that. So you got 3.1.0 of Spring Boot. Again, that's one of the big topics of Spring Boot 3. What are some of the other really cool things that you see coming out of Spring that are kind of making you really excited for where it's going?
So that's the big one. That's the one where I spend a lot of time. So the native images, just the power that we're getting a lot of additional features along the way. And the thing about the Spring ecosystem is every week, just about, there's a new project that's coming out with a new release, right? The Spring team isn't massive. There's a limited number of people that are working on it, but they're all working on different parts of the ecosystem and they're all releasing new stuff. And that release process, it really kind of all boils down to the Spring framework, right? That's the underpinning, that's the base framework for all the other projects. And it's Spring framework gets a release, then Spring Boot gets a release, then Spring Cloud gets a release, and then the other projects they have dependencies. So upstream gets a release and then the others kind of come after that. So the nice thing is there's always something new. There's always a new feature. And a lot of times I find myself questioning myself, like, hey, am I going down the right path? If something becomes too difficult for me, like, well, how would I do this? I take a step back and I'm like, I can't be the first one who's ever tried to do this thing. Let me go and ask. And now I'm in a really fortunate and unique position where when I don't have the answers, I have Slack and I can reach out to people that have done it and I can get the answers like, hey, here's the fast way to do that. Here's the better way to do what you're trying to do. So it's been amazing. I've gotten to learn all these things and I'm constantly trying to kind of map it to what I did in the past, right? It is 2023 and I still have scars from, having to rack servers in the data center. And a lot of the developers today, they don't realize how good they have it.
No.
Like all of these things that the Spring team, just focusing on the Spring team, on what they've done for me, every time there's a new release, I look back and like, man, I wish I had that in 2014. Man, I wish I had that in 2018. Because it's so amazing that they are at the front of this. And I've really come to learn that those engineers on the Spring team, they care about what you want. I was at Spring I/O a few weeks ago, and to see the way that they are engaging, like, hey, we're working on this cool thing. What do you think? Before they ever go to production, they're asking, like, what do you think about this? Would this be valuable? So that they know where to spend their time. And I'm just blown away by how much they care about what the community is doing and how they decide what to work on. It seems sometimes like it's just magic and somebody had an idea and they did. No, there's tons of research that goes into it. There's tons of work that goes into every decision that they make. And it blows my mind how they do it so well. And that team is spread out all over the world. So yeah, I get giddy over these kind of things. Not just the product that they're putting out, but also the way that they're delivering the product, right? We recently had this pandemic. The Spring team has been remote since day one.
Yeah.
So that, there is a lot of things that I was kind of looking towards how the Spring team is handling things to realize, like, hey, how should we do this here? How should this org be doing it? What are they doing that's different than the Spring team? Because they've had some success. And not every team is like the Spring team. But yeah, they've set some really amazing examples. They're doing some really amazing things.
The first time I used Spring Boot, it was amazing. I was like, oh my God, Spring gets it. They care about all the thousands and thousands of enterprise developers out there that didn't really have access to modern architectures, modern tooling. And unless it was under the guise of Spring or Java, it was very hard for developers within, let's say, larger, stodgier organizations to make a case for introducing something. But because it was under Spring, it was a much easier sell. And they were able to bring all these people into that modern fold. I mean, it's had a huge impact.
Yeah. And the way it's open source. So
Yeah, right.
I've been lucky enough to work with orgs, and I've done some things the wrong way, and I've been kind of the developer. Oh, I know what's right, and this is going to be amazing, and I've done my own thing.
Sure.
But I've been lucky to sit with some amazing engineers, and one of the changes that it was a pivotal change for me was watching an engineer at a customer at the time. They were using the Spring framework, and they were running into an issue like, oh, this doesn't behave the way I expected it to behave. And I watched as they said, hey, are we on the latest version? Okay, we're on the latest version. Let's go look at the notes. Is there any issue that's open related to this? Okay, there was no issue related to this. So they started writing their issue. And this is all in the matter of 10 minutes. They're like, oh, well, here's what I saw. Here's what I expected. It's probably around this spot in the code. They opened up the source code of the library that they were using from the Spring team. They opened it up and they go, yeah, I think it might be related to this. And they created the ticket. And then they opened an IDE. They pulled down the project. And they said, oh, I know where the problem. And they started fixing it. And made a PR all within 10, maybe it was 30 minutes, we'll say. They went from,
That's
hey,
tremendous.
I found an issue. I ran into an issue. I created an issue. Hey, here's what I expected. Here's what I got. Here's my output. Here's an example. And then they opened up the source code and they created a PR for the issue. And I still get excited when a PR that I submitted, when that gets accepted and that gets merged into anything, I still get excited about that. I still have giddy feelings, and I know that there's 5 PRs out there today that I'm waiting for somebody to do an accept on. So that's a dopamine kind of hit. That's a great feeling to be in. And I know that this is happening across the Spring ecosystem, but to see that customer at the time go through those steps, it changed the way I looked at software development. It changed the way I looked at open source and being a good citizen of the open source community. It was that day, and that was in 2018. And I've ever since, that's kind of the mindset. So it had been Spring. That was kind of the bulk of what I was doing. But in 2020 and the beginning of 2021, I had delivered PRs in a bunch of different languages. I think there was 5 where I was like, hey, yeah, it's okay. I can figure my way out, and I can figure things out. When you've done things for a while, you kind of figure out, hey, where could I go look? It might take a while. But I was excited about delivering PRs in a bunch of different languages. But I was also kind of I'd already had my favorite, right? That was this Spring stuff. And I got excited about the Spring shell and the CLI, and combined with the native image processing, I was able to do some really interesting things without a lot of mess, without a lot of hardware. And I started taking all of these Python, Ruby, Bash projects that I had, and I started converting them to Spring Shell CLIs. So I was using the framework that I loved, and I knew all my cheat codes, and I had my patterns. So it didn't take me long to convert them over. So now I've got a collection that's mostly Spring, so that if I want to maintain it, if I want to push out a new release, it's okay. I'm comfortable pushing out a new release. 5-10 years ago, I had repositories with 10 or 15 different languages in them. So to maintain that one that I did in PowerShell 5 years ago, to maintain that, there's kind of I got to go through the kind of learning curve again. I got to upgrade all the versions again. And that was kind of a pain. So now I don't have that. I don't have the learning curve or the mind context. I don't have to remember how the language difference makes it easier. So I'm in a much happier place now that I have all these tools that I can not just deliver, but I can deliver on Raspberry Pi. Raspberry Pis. I like to show off my Raspberry Pis. Raspberry Pis. I can Kubernetes cluster on this Raspberry Pi, and it can be all Spring apps. And now we've got the gateway API, so I can do even more stuff with Spring. And it's just exciting that I don't have to change my comfort zone in order to deliver enterprise grade workloads on hobby grade products. on hobby grade hardware, and it's wonderful. It's a fun time to be a developer.
So there is a comment I want to bring up. Simon Verhoeven has been commenting, and one of the things he said was he enjoys the ease of development and setup. One has to love the new test container dev mode. And that's what I was clicking on, and I hit a video. Like, yes. Oh no! But I was looking at just briefly. This looks really powerful.
So this is a new feature that came out with 3.1. And the whole idea is, if I'm using Redis or I'm using MySQL or MariaDB, I have these test containers. And what a test container does is it'll start up in a container my database. So I don't have to install Postgres or Redis on my laptop. If I use test containers and it starts up really, really fast because in a container, I can start up a container, I can deploy a schema, I can deploy some data and have that. And it used to be just for like integration tests or end-to-end tests where you use test containers. But now we want to have kind of a better developer experience. And Oleg Shayev, he kind of showed me first, it was a couple of months ago, how you could have like a running instance without a whole lot of configuration that would automatically start up the containers that you need. So we've all probably seen a repository that has a Docker Compose file in it, right? Like, oh, hey, yeah, that makes sense. Hey, you want to run against your backing services? Hey, here's a Docker Compose, run the backing services, and then start your Spring Boot app. And that makes sense, and it did make sense. But it's still another thing that I needed to add to my repositories. And I got really excited when I saw Oleg's demo, where he was in his test loop, local development, run that application, and it was pulling up a Redis and a Postgres, for example, automatically. No Docker Compose. It was just using these test containers that were defined in his test sources. And he was able to run it locally. So as you're making changes, it's automatically able to run against a backing service. And it's a whole new experience for developers. Josh Long does a really good demo of how this works. He did one at Spring I/O. Take a look at that if you get a chance. It's a brave new world where we don't even have to have a Docker Compose. We can literally check out a repository and Maven Spring Boot run, and you're good to go. Or you can start it and have it automatically redeploy every time you're making changes and re-up in your IDE using the Spring Boot dev tools. So the experience today, right? Think back when you didn't have even Docker. Think back when we were installing Oracle and WebLogic on our desktop, and we didn't have 4 gig machines back then. We had 4 gig maybe if you're lucky, but we had a bunch of stuff that we had to run locally to do any work. So we've come so far in a few years to where now we can do a bunch of this stuff, and I don't even have any of it. I don't have anything other than my IDE installed, and I can have this great developer experience with all the backing services, all the application server because it's built into my Spring Boot, all the backing services that I connect to because they're available as test containers. And that same workload is going to go work in production the exact same way.
I just grabbed let me see if I can get this one here. Beck, I don't know, can you share my screen? There we go. So I just grabbed just to give people an idea, a little flavor for this. Found a blog post that was talking about this. So like just spinning up a Postgres SQL container and a Kafka container just by annotating a service connection and kicking off looks like it's a particular container from there. That's pretty wild.
It's amazing.
Wow.
It's amazing. And there's no Docker Compose.
That's very
There's no Docker Compose.
If you have a Docker Compose but want to do this, is there something I can slurp it in?
It'll automatically recognize your Docker Compose and slurp it in.
Wow.
What?
Wow. Okay.
Yes.
Wild. All right. Well, anyway, so we'll post that particular link as one of the examples in the show notes. But that's very cool. All right. So that's a big deal right there.
It is.
And so now talking about like the native support, right? So you've been doing Graal VM compiling. Spring Boot has the ability for it to go through and kind of play through with the AOP and AOT and such. So what are you seeing there? Let's talk a little bit about that.
All right. So I get excited about this. So,
no, you don't.
If we've been around Spring for a while, a lot of folks have already migrated to some Spring Boot 2.x. Mm-hmm. A lot of folks have already migrated to 3.x, and they're able to stay current. But depending on the size of your organization, depending on those applications where they live, sometimes there's ones that kind of slip through the cracks. Hey, if it's not broke, let's not fix it. And I really get excited. I want to help people migrate to the latest and greatest. And this is kind of what it looks like. Hey, you're running Spring Boot 2 and you want to go to 3. Well, with Spring Boot 3, we rebased. Like you have to get up to Java 17 first. So new image. So you cannot take your Spring Boot 2.5 and just automatically upgrade. The first thing you have to do is upgrade to Java 17. The nice thing about that is as you upgrade to Java 17, you're going to get a bunch of performance improvement. The JVM, the improvements with the JVM have been absolutely amazing. One thing, I'm going to step back now. One thing that I encourage everybody to do is take a look at how you're doing garbage collection. You have a bunch of options. So even on your Java 8 workloads, Java 11 workloads, take a look. Did you choose the right garbage collection? It doesn't take a lot of time. Run a test, change the garbage collection, run another test, just to make sure that you're not missing out on some value. The same thing comes with the JVM. Like, take some time. A lot of organizations say, yep, we're all in on this version of the JVM, and then everything gets it. When some JVMs might, out of the box, be better for some use cases, but just take the time. Do a test. There's lots of open source JVMs out there. There's lots of ones where you can get commercial support, but take the time to decide which one is going to be best for your workload. So as you're moving to Java or to Spring Boot 3, first thing you have to do is get to Java 17. Find a Java 17 version. You're going to get a ton of benefit on your Spring Boot 2.x workloads, but now you've opened yourself up to upgrade to Spring Boot 3. Now, one of the things that you can do, there's lots of amazing tools out there. Most of the Java 8, Java 11 to Java 17 things can be handled by your IDE, like the Jakarta versus Java X, those things. Those are going to be handled pretty easily by a lot of IDEs. But there's also open rewrite. There's open rewrite rules that you can just run against your code base, and it'll make it ready for Java 17. So now you've got your workloads that are ready to run Java 17. Now you can run Spring Boot 3. Again, there's open rewrite rules. So we have this kind of journey. Make sure you get to Java 17, then get to Spring Boot 3. And as you get to Spring Boot 3, now you're in that spot where like, hey, there's tons of value, but there's now this other option where I can do the AOT processing and I can get even more value out of that workload. So what does that mean? The AOT processing, ahead of time processing, means GraalVM is going to take a look at your code, whatever that is, and it's going to analyze everywhere that it can go. It's going to use up all the processor it can. It's going to use up all the memory that it has available, and it's going to analyze every branch of code that's in that workload. It's going to throw away all the code that it doesn't need. It's going to take a little bit of the JVM, just the bits that it needs, a little bit of garbage collector, a little bit of the JVM, and it's going to take everything else and it's going to deliver a statically linked binary. So an EXE for Windows. It's going to deliver a statically linked binary that you can run on a smaller footprint. So the JVM, one of the criticisms of the JVM is its footprint, memory footprint, right? When we're delivering things in containers, typically a 2 GB container is what you need, because as it loads its classes, as it starts up, it takes a little bit of time to start up, but then it's also got the garbage collector, so it kind of evens out. But at a minimum, you're kind of looking at a 2 gig container going to production. Well, with AOT processing, you're not going to get all the benefits of the JVM. You're going to get a statically linked native image, but you're going to be running on a smaller footprint. It's not bringing all of the JVM. So your image size, it might be bigger because it's got to include the bits from the JVM. So that EXE might be larger than the jar file, but the container that you're delivering to production doesn't have to include the JVM. So it'll have the, in case one, it's got the operating system, the JVM, and your jar file. And let's say that that's 250 megs. After AOT processing, that container is just the operating system and the native image. So that might be 150 megs. So just the container image is going to be smaller. But then what that container needs to run in memory, in case one, it's going to be at a minimum 2 gigs is what you're taking to production. But in case two, it might be as small as 512 or even 256 megabytes for that image to run in production. So there's trade-offs, right? It takes a little bit longer. The time that it takes for that GraalVM to do the AOT processing, it takes a little bit of time. So instead of a 5-second recompile, It might be 2 minutes, depending on your machine, to analyze all the bits, analyze all the branches to determine what that new image. There's tons of benefit with it. Again, that smaller footprint, that faster startup time, running in production, it's pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing that I can actually now run, like I said, I can run these Spring Boot, Spring Cloud workloads on Raspberry Pis. That's the AOT processing. So you kind of, there's all of these steps that we're looking at. It's like, hey, I want to get from Spring Boot 2.x to 3.x. I want to get from Java 8 or Java 11 to Java 17. Once you do that, then you have this whole new frontier of looking at these AOT workloads. Go ahead.
Does remote debugging work the same against GraalVM Java apps?
So it's getting better. It's getting better. So here's the example. We're all working on a project, and this is kind of my use case that I get excited about. We're all working on a project, and we've actually got 100 different apps that we're working on to make up our big A app. The Chariot E to E or whatever we call it, our big A app. In order for us to stay current and keep track, especially that we're remote, the idea of sending these tinier, faster startup containers for development, I like to run Kubernetes on my laptop. I like to run Kubernetes locally. If I'm making updates, we're kind of front edge, and we're delivering dozens of these releases to production every week. How do you stay updated with my versions? How do I stay updated with your versions? Delivering those native images, it's a smaller file. So as I mentioned, when I had teammates all over the world, the images that we were delivering, those, even just the jars that we were delivering, that became really expensive and really slow. And it was hard for the team that was in Taiwan or Romania. It was hard for them to keep up with the latest and greatest just because of internet. Yeah, internet's a little bit faster, but now I've got these smaller images. The other thing is because they're native images and they start up sub-second. I can run them all on something like Kubernetes with Knative serving. So I can have 100 different apps, all the latest and greatest, because they come down really easy. They're only 90 megs for the layer. I can get them easily, and they're all running, but they're all scaled to 0. So I can have my IDE open. I can have all 100 apps open, and I've just got a 16 gig laptop. But I can have hundreds of apps running scaled to 0 on my laptop, and I can be working against the latest and greatest. So when I want to do an end-to-end test, or when I want to verify contracts, I can have everything running. I can do a demo of the whole thing locally. I can see what that experience looks like, and things start up and shut down as they need to. That's what I get excited about, because I've sat in that seat where I had hundreds of developers spread out over the world, and it was difficult to get them to stay on the latest and greatest version. It was difficult not only then, but I had to give them a VM that was big enough to where they could run all of those 100 apps. Again, if there were 2 gigabyte containers, even if they were running in a single Tomcat, it was difficult to run that many workloads for every developer. So they're not stomping on toes. We didn't want to give every developer a shared instance, right? We've kind of learned that lesson, even though some people are still doing that. Every developer could have their own instance. Now, on a 16 gig laptop, I can give every developer the latest and greatest of everything. It can be running. It can be downloading the latest versions as it goes and running on my laptop, scaled to 0. I can run my IDE, all the apps, and Slack all at the same time.
I was going to say, and Slack,
Yeah.
right?
And
Here's my giant set of apps that fits in
I
small.
still have.
Then here comes
Yep.
Slack.
I still have room for Slack. So this is where we're at.
Yeah.
This is the exciting time.
Wild.
So once you've gotten to that, you're getting all this value. But then I'm just giddy about the developer experience. Now let's think about what that means in production for a customer that has hundreds of apps that maybe translate to thousands of instances of those containers, right? If they're 2 gig containers today, and we could get them to, let's just say 512 megabyte containers as native images. And of course, not all of them are going to get benefit out of that. So let's just say 25% of those 1,000 apps that are running production, and let's say 250 of those are at 2 gigs, 500 gigs of memory in production. But let's say just that 25%, we could get to AOT. So that's now we're at 512 meg times 250. There's a massive savings by just getting some workloads, not all, but taking some workloads into a smaller container with faster startup time that's on the latest and greatest, so you're now more secure and current. Getting to that place in production, somebody that makes that decision is going to get a pat on the back, right? Because that's real value, like dollar value. And as a developer, that's giddy, like developer value. Like I get excited about those types of things. When I started programming, like when I was young, high school, middle school, one of the big things, we didn't have gigabytes of memory. Like that was not a thing. It was megabytes. So if you were building a game, it was about how small could you make that game? How much could you do in the tiny amount of memory that you had? How interesting could you do things? Well, maybe that's some of my baggage where I still get excited clearly about doing enterprise grade patterns, enterprise architectures on Raspberry Pis.
It's really cool that you can get back now to like thinking about smaller, less resources to do the same thing because these abstractions are now here and these frameworks are here.
Yeah.
I'm curious. I want to step back to the developer experience a minute. So when you've got your 100 little tiny micro apps, so to speak.
Yeah.
When people are using those, I'm assuming if there's a change, they pull down the source, rebuild it, or do you also deliver the binaries version as well?
So
to make the life faster.
Great question. So I don't want to build the native images locally. So my experience locally, if I'm working on an app, and this goes back to the remote debugging, I don't want to take the time to do a native image process, even though it's like 5 minutes or 2 minutes, or depending on your laptop. I don't want to wait for that time when I'm in my inner loop development. Mm-hmm. I'm going to do the same way. But then there's the question about like, what happens if it's a bug that only shows up in the native image or in production? It's a different one. Then you still have that native image debugging. That is getting better all the time. But I don't do a lot of it. So just to be honest, I don't do a lot of it. I know that people are doing it. But as a local loop, inner loop development, I'm doing things the way I normally do. And then as I do my git commit, I've got 2 branches. I've got one that does the regular, hey, let me deliver a container with the JVM, but I also have another one that says, let me deliver a native image. And I actually do it in 2 different ways. I deliver a native image for ARM64 and a native image for x86 because some of my teammates are using M1s. They're using ARM64 devices. So I want to give them an ARM64 image. So I've got this branch, but it doesn't affect me. It doesn't affect my developer experience, but it massively improves their developer experience. Mm-hmm. So as they're pulling down the native images of the stuff that I'm building. They're still in their inner loop development. They're working with the JVM. They're working with the IDE, and they have got all the hooks into the IDE that we're used to. We have all those benefits. But then when they hit commit, it's going through the same pipelines, through the same supply chains, doing all the same security validation, and it's delivering multiple artifacts. Because one of the other things is you get all this benefit out of the native image, but ARM64, I don't know if you've heard, is kind of making a move. And we've kind of seen that you can take the same workload running on an x86 without doing the native image. You can take the same workload that's running on x86. You can run it on ARM64, and you can save, in some cases, 33% off the top. If you're running in the cloud, 33% better. Really? I'll tell you a secret. I like it so much that I'm buying one of the Ampere developer worktops or developer kits that's got I think it's 94 core Ampere that I can run and play with, because there's going to be a lot of these types of workloads, and it's exciting, and I can have that, and it's quiet, and it uses less resources, and I'm going to replace those heavier, more expensive devices. So yeah, this is it's an amazing time. And for a long time, I feel like developers didn't have to worry as much about the application running in production.
Yeah.
Like,
right.
hey, if it's going to be 100 instances, it's 100 instances. That's what we're going to do. We'll scale up, and yeah, no problem. I noticed a lot more about, oh, we can't buy that thing. I don't want to make the argument for that backing service, even though it might be massively better. Nobody was making the argument to go and buy Oracle, right? Nobody was like, oh, I'll fight that fight because it's going to be better for this use case. People were hesitant to do that. But now in this Spring ecosystem, we can get all this massive value without having to ask for any money. And in fact, we can make some of these easy incremental decisions, and we can start seeing money come back automatically from our cloud spend, from our infrastructure spend, from our developer experience. We're seeing all this value. And then, you know what? I do want to go and buy Oracle because Oracle is going to be better for this use case. Look at all the money that we just found.
Right. You save the money that you would normally spend in the standard scalable infrastructure by not needing as much of it.
Finding and then these things, I don't know if you're aware, but there's kind of been lots of layoffs and things are kind of real, shaky, and finances are crazy, and the stock market's jumping around. Like, these things matter. And now we're at the point where I feel like I'm at this level as a developer of the abstractions. All this work has been done for me where my decisions, I can kind of see what it's going to deliver. I can see the effects of my decisions, and I don't have to wait 6 years to see the outcomes of the decisions that I make. I can see them because we're moving faster and we're making changes faster. But now I can also see the budget type, those dollars and cents kind of decisions. I can see how, if I'm comparing myself to the team on the other side of the floor or the other organization, and I've got 25% of my workloads that are running in production as native images, and I've saved that 75% of infrastructure on those, when there's a side by side and you're looking, those types of wins are going to matter wherever you are and whatever your career journey is. Those types of things are going to matter, especially if you care about the company that you work for. Making those decisions, taking the time to exercise a little bit of a test to see, is it worth it to go down this path? Maybe there's lots of workloads where the native image is not going to perform the way that you want it to. You're actually going to lose value. But understand the difference. Not every workload's going to go down that path. But if you can get into the practice of validating and checking and revalidating some of the assumptions that you made. There was that recent Amazon Prime. We're like, oh yeah, we started off doing microservices and all this. It was microservices and Lambdas. And they're like, oh yeah, we decided that now we could save a boatload of money by just taking those and turning them into monoliths running on the VM.
I was actually going to ask about that because thinking about all these tiny little services, it reminds me of like your serverless function concept in that you could scale it to zero. Now, I don't know that you would be advocating for scale to zero in production for everything, but there's got to be workloads that are infrequent, and because they start so quickly, it's probably advantageous compared to a serverless platform for that because it can scale up and in more threads because we're in Java.
Yeah. So the scale to zero, the native image stuff is just one side. So I talked about the JVM workloads. There's another option. We call it's CRAC. It's coordinated restore and checkpoints. So what it's doing, like the JVM, it says, hey, I'm going to load all these classes. I'm going to do all the work that's the bulk of that startup time for a Java workload, for a Spring workload. I'm going to take all that and I'm going to take a snapshot. I'm going to take a checkpoint of, hey, all the classes are loaded, and I'm going to grab a snapshot of that class loader of the JVM at that point in time. So the next time I start it, I'm going to say, hey, I want to use that snapshot, and I want to start from there. I want to start from that checkpoint. So the next time I start it, I'm starting up in that sub-second startup, but I have all the benefits of the JVM, and now I'm running production. So I can scale to zero still. My container size is going to be a little bit different, but now I've got all the benefits that the JVM provides. So that's the other super exciting scale to zero option that we have today.
It's like Snap Start.
Yeah, which uses CRAC under the covers.
Okay. Oh, cool.
Yes. So that was delivered by the folks at Azul. Like, How amazing is that? And we've now got support for that in Spring Boot 3.1.0. So we have all of these different options for scale to zero. So whether your workload benefits from being a native image, or it needs the benefits of running on the JVM, we've got these scale to zero options that are just, you see the goosebumps? It's just exciting. It's an exciting time to be a Java developer, and the Spring team has just made it even that much more exciting going forward.
I wrote a blog post recently, a couple days ago, that was like, you may have moved on, but Java is just getting better and better, basically.
It does.
It is. And Spring is going along with it, which is really cool. So you've got all these really people who have thought about how to make production and development experiences better over time, and haven't stopped doing that. But you might have jumped off of Java. This is for everyone watching. You may have jumped off of Java at like 8. It's even better, and you have a lot more options today than you used to.
Yes.
For programming in Java and running, and especially if you haven't learned Spring and you're on Java, you should learn Spring, because it is the thing that for any kind of servers, it's just.
I'm 100% biased. I'm totally biased.
Oh, I know, but I love it too. I've loved it ever since I've used it. So.
Yep.
But it's a good point. Like, just going through all this stuff, and then I fired up a Spring Boot 3 server on top of the Java 20 training class I was running. I'm like, haha, everything's there.
Yep.
You don't have to get a license for everything. You don't have to, get eval copies. It's all open source, and it's still great. And and getting better and better.
And production ready. So it's not like, it's not open source that, you got to go and buy an upgrade in order for it to be production. No, you get all the things. Yeah. The Spring Framework, Spring Boot, Spring Cloud, all the things, Spring Data, all those things are production grade. There is no like cap and, you don't get these features until you pay for it. Like everything is out there, and it's absolutely mind blowing that that's the way that things are operating. There's been a lot of, taking a step back, there's a lot of open source projects that they got to figure out a way to make money. And how are we going to make money? Yeah, and the Spring team, I think it really started off, and they were just training people. That was kind of the way that it started. It's like, hey, we're going to show you the shortcuts and do the training, right? And that's how they made their money.
Right.
I don't know how they make money today.
For a little tiny bit of time, they were doing the Spring DM server.
Yeah.
The OSGI server, and there was a commercial venture there. I'm so glad that when they stopped doing that, they didn't just implode. Because a lot of companies, that would have killed them.
Yep.
But VMware purchased them and said, we believe in you, keep going, which is kind of, it's a very rare thing to see that they keep them open source like that. Certainly there's the enterprise support licenses and stuff like that. That certainly is required for larger companies. But you can still develop in Spring like you could in 2005. Go get it, go play with it, work with it. You got everything everybody else does, which is fantastic. Where do we go? Where's the best place to go to look at more? I mean, obviously YouTube. But do you have a good set of resources that we can go to that you would recommend to see for more of your writing and your colleagues?
Yeah, so spring.io.
Of course.
Spring.io is where everything starts. I also run the Spring office hours, which will happen later today. And this is a thing that it's kind of similar to this, where we just kind of talk live. We'll have a topic that we're going to talk about. We like to talk about like the latest releases and what's coming down the pipe from the Spring team. But we also kind of open it up to questions. Simon, who showed up today, he's one of our regulars, where it's just like, I wish, back when I was, a developer and I was delivering Spring to production, I wished that I had better access. The Spring team and the Spring developer advocates, they were amazing. They made me feel like I had a extended team, is what I like to say. I might get emotional here, but they really made me feel like I had an extended team, because when they answered an issue on GitHub, it touched me. Like it made me feel like I was connected to them. But I wish I had more. And this Spring office hours is kind of that more. I would have loved to have something like Spring office hours that was weekly, where I could go in and like, I'm stuck on this. I just grabbed the latest version of Spring Data Redis and I ran into this issue. Can you help me? I wish that I had, and sometimes it's not us, the hosts, that answer it. Sometimes it's people like Simon that have already, I already ran into that, and he's answering it in the chat during the session. So we've got this nice little community similar to this one, where we've got Spring developers that are excited about it, and I call them Spring developer advocates, because typically the people that are showing up, they're also going back to their organizations and they're kind of sharing like, hey, I figured it out, and they're getting people excited about it. So it's a wonderful experience. But that part of it, that part of like, hey, we've got this chance, and sometimes people straggle in, but pretty much every week somebody says, how do I learn more about Spring? Well, now we've got spring.academy. So spring.io is kind of our default. That's where all the documentation, there's guides, there's tutorials, there's blogs about all the latest releases. But spring.academy is a resource where you can go and get, it's like online training, and it has a course. It's got a flow for you to go and learn the fundamentals. And it also has a paid option where you can go in and say, hey, I want a year's worth of this, and at the end I want to take a test. And you can get certified in Spring. So if you know, not that long ago, Spring certifications were kind of expensive. And it was almost, if you wanted to do it at scale, you had 10 people on your team. That became a real big budget item. But now I want to say it's like $299 or something. It's affordable. So for teams of size 10 to 100, it's affordable. And it's easy to do. Spring.academy is amazing. So yeah,
Very
if you're
cool.
looking to learn more about Spring.io and Spring.academy are the main resources that I'd point you towards.
Fantastic. Well, DaShaun, thank you so much for being with us today. We really enjoyed it.
This has been fun. I get excited, and I'm still kind of jazzed about the experience that I had at Philadelphia ETE. I made a lot of connections.
Yeah.
I made a lot of connections, and I'm still having conversations that have started at that conference. So yeah.
Every time I hear you, I get 10 times more excited. I'm like, what else can this guy talk about? Because it gets me excited.
That's great speaker. So you're a good motivator.
Well, thank you. I hope that we can do this again. And yeah, we're lucky to be connected, but again, it's the same. There's kind of a community. We've got people that have joined us for the show. Like, it's something special about the Spring community, and I include you guys in that. Is like, it's a friendly place. It's a place for you to come and learn, and hopefully somebody learns something from this episode. But it's always fun. It's always fun to talk about, and sometimes I always talk about like the Alt Tab thing. You didn't learn that from reading the documentation. Somebody was sitting next to you. You saw them do it on the screen. And you're like, whoa.
Yeah.
What was that? Right? Like, that's something that has, been spread across the world, but nobody read the documentation to figure that out. It was somebody who was sitting next to them, and they saw it happen, and like, how did you do that? And then you just kind of picked it up. And that's sometimes that's how people learn. So that's another part of the Spring Office Hours, and it's another reason why shows like this are super valuable. Sometimes you don't know what you don't know, and it's great to know.
Tell me about it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right, man. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate it. It was fun. I hope to do it again.
Thanks, DaShaun. Yep, absolutely.
Right. Thanks.
Take care.
See ya.
Mm-hmm.